Right, we're up to the 80s, and based on just the overall viewing numbers, I think I'll stop with the 80s, and then I might do a power rankings of every season from 79-80 through until 2018, 2019, and see what I come up with. And I'll use the same formula, which everybody can agree they don't like, which is fine. There's not going to be a formula that people like. As of, for instance, there might be a team that people say, well, they were a really good team, but they ran into a better team in the first round, and that team doesn't deserve points because they had a better, easier opponent in the first round. And so, see, there's a lot of subjective that gets in, and when the subjective gets in, it's out. So, power rankings during the season, I can use some kind of objective or subjectivity when it comes to where teams are in the rankings, but with something like this, I don't want that subjectivity in there. I want it to just be an objective. Okay, here are your points, and there's a certain amount given out for regular season. Not very many, gotta be honest, not very many for regular season success. Most of your power rankings for a decade are going to be about who wins Stanley Cups and who's consistently good. So, all that being said, number 21 out of 21 teams on this list is New Jersey. So, a team that was, doing really well in the 1990s and the 2000s, not so great in the 80s. And of course, this was including time that they were in Denver as the Colorado Rockies. So, the New Jersey Devils, a team that moved twice, and thus far, still in New Jersey. No talks of relocation right now. And I say right now because there have been talks at certain points with New Jersey about relocation, as crazy as that may sound. Every now and then there's kind of a, well, if they can't get this building, well, if they can't get this money, well. So, anyways, number 21's New Jersey. Number 20, the Penguins. The Penguins, it was a rough decade for them. And again, I did the video on Mario Lemieux and them getting Lemieux, but the real, advantage of getting Lemieux didn't become a playoff advantage until right around 89 is when we started to see it. So it was a number of years outside the playoffs for Pittsburgh and a really poorly run organization for the Penguins as well at the time that then Craig Patrick takes over and he did some amazing things with. So the Penguins, rough time, 20th overall in the 80s. Number 19, we're into another team that's moved. And there's a pattern here. Hartford Whalers, and yes, that's the one Whalers magnet that I have made, and I apologize, but getting Whalers stuff is difficult. It just is. So, the Whalers, it was not a horrible decade, really. They had a couple of pretty good teams. They just couldn't get anywhere in the playoffs. So, due to a lack of playoff success, they still find themselves at 19th on the decade. And again, mid to late 80s, they had a couple of pretty good teams that looked like they might go somewhere, and I was really, really hoping, and that just never happened. And then they go to Carolina, and playoff success seems to happen almost every time they're in the playoffs. So I don't know. I can't figure it out either. Number 18. And this team was having a tough decade. So this is right in the Harold Ballard era. The Toronto Maple Leafs. Yeah, it wasn't a proud time. So these are four franchises that were struggling. And this one's moved. This one's threatened to move. This one had moved during that decade. Toronto ain't going anywhere. But again, they were being run really, really poorly. And there's a reason that Toronto fans aren't a huge fan of that logo. It just kind of symbolizes the fact they didn't win any cups when that was the design of the logo. They had a somewhat similar design when they won it in '67, but it's not that logo. So that didn't win anything. That didn't go to the Stanley Cup Finals either. Number 17. Not a great decade for teams in the Smythe division that weren't named Calgary or Edmonton. And for the LA Kings, it was a rough decade. And it was a rough time, too, for Marcel Dion. He'd end up going to the New York Rangers at the end of the decade. I'll just shift that over a little bit. And, yeah, so for LA, rough decade. Now, what's interesting, too, is 5 Stanley Cups since then. They've had, 3 Stanley Cups since then? 2 Stanley Cups since then? And then you have Toronto, and Carolina's won a Stanley Cup as well. They didn't win one as Hartford, but Carolina won a Stanley Cup. So, bad team one decade doesn't mean they're not going to be good later. So, that's sort of a rah-rah hope for Detroit fans right now, right? Anyways, so yeah, 17 goes to the LA Kings. At 16, a team that struggled in both the Norris and Smythe divisions. And at 16, we have the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets, Yeah, Dale Hawerchuk was their big prize that year. That they finished last overall. They had the 9-win season. The fact that they're this high up in a decade where they had 9 wins in one of their seasons tells you they did bounce back. They did have some decent enough runs, but they've since moved to Arizona. So that's the odd thing, is that we talk a lot about attendance and teams that aren't stable, but success will bring stability for the most part. I remember Chicago struggling to draw fans in the early 2000s, and and then all of a sudden there's success, and they don't have any trouble drawing at all. So there's your bottom row from the 80s, and you'll see I've done my best to provide logos where I can from the era. If I don't have the logo from the era, I can't put it on the board. I'm not drawing it. I'm not hand drawing it. Number 15. Rough start to the decade. By the end of the decade, Detroit was looking a lot better. So the Detroit Red Wings end up finishing in the third row on this board. And yes, I'm using the oversized logos, which people are like, you should use those all the time. Right, except they won't fit on a regular Power Rankings board with 31 teams. This was a decade that had 21, so it's a lot easier to fit the oversized logos onto it. Detroit, like I said, they picked things up towards the end of the decade. They started having some pretty good regular seasons, and they did have a run to the conference finals during the 80s as well. So there was some good things happening for them, and some signs that things were going to get a lot better soon. Number 14, a team that had a really tough time at the start of the decade. Like, they hadn't made the playoffs. They had the 8 wins in their first season. And it's another one. I actually have, I ordered a couple weeks ago, and I have an oversized logo of their original logo. I just haven't turned it into a magnet yet. The plan is to start doing that. The funny thing is that in terms of my hours, I'm probably working a lot more right now than I did during the hockey season. So there are a lot of times where it just wrote itself, where I could just stand here and tell you guys, hey, here's what happened. This is great. And the videos might be longer, but it was easier work. And now I'm doing a lot more work, including the making magnets part of things. So for Washington, and I know they didn't use that back then. That's why I made the overlong mention of the fact that I don't have the magnet for that. The Capitals had a good run after they got Rod Langway and after things started getting better in terms of their management. Some good coaching going on there as well. Couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. That wouldn't happen until 1998 and then again in 2018, so every 20 years. And the Capitals were a team that was somewhat struggling. Now, number 13, a team that was also struggling, the Vancouver Canucks. Yep, the Canucks, right around where they've been in every decade, isn't it? This is kind of weird how the Canucks are like 12th, 13th, or 14th in every decade. Just right in that mushy middle overall. But I will say this, Vancouver is buoyed by their Stanley Cup Finals appearance. Without that Stanley Cup Finals appearance, they're right down here. So if they had gone out in the first round, if they'd gone out in the first round that year, they would have ended up right about here. So that Stanley Cup Finals appearance definitely helps them on the decade. It was a miserable time for most of the time for Vancouver fans. But I believe they were 12th overall in the NHL the year that they went to the Stanley Cup Finals. So, yeah, having them 13th on the board is probably pretty accurate for the decade. They didn't have any success in the playoffs other than that Stanley Cup Finals run. They didn't win a round the rest of the decade. Number 12, a team that did pretty well, didn't reach the finals, but the Quebec Nordiques, yeah, there were some good little runs there. And, of course, their feud with the Montreal Canadiens was epic. And there were some great brawls that took place, including the last one we saw in hockey. And the Quebec Nordiques were a team that I greatly enjoyed following. And to this day, it saddens me that they're not in the NHL anymore. No offense to Colorado fans, but I would love to have the Quebec Nordiques back. Not at the expense of Colorado Avalanche, but yeah. And that's why when people say, do you think Quebec gets a team? I say no. I can't see that logo being worn by an NHL team again. And it's not that I don't want to see it. It's just that financially, I can't see how it works. I can't see how the NHL says yes, and you find an owner who goes, yep, I'll spend about $1 billion Canadian to bring a team in that I'm going to have to pay in American dollars, even though the Canadian dollar isn't very good. It just, the logistics of it just become a nightmare. So this was a good decade, and it made it even sadder then in 95 when the team goes to Colorado. But Good decade, and then towards the end of the decade, things started falling off the rails. And then, of course, the early 90s, you get into the whole Lindros thing and everything. Number 11 on the decade, Buffalo. Buffalo didn't have a Stanley Cup Finals run in there, but they had some nice little runs in there themselves. And yeah, that was a half decent decade for Buffalo. But again, without that long playoff run, they end up finishing just outside the top 10. So good regular season teams. They won their division a few times in there, but they couldn't get over the hump. And of course, this is the one team that Scotty Bowman was around that didn't end up winning a championship. Where he'd win championships in Montreal, Detroit, Pittsburgh, just couldn't quite get Buffalo there. I think he had good ideas though. You look back at some of the moves he made. He had some pretty smart ideas in there. It just didn't quite come together with Buffalo, and then he ends up moving on. And it's too bad because Buffalo, much like Vancouver, is still seeking that first Stanley Cup. But it is noteworthy. Vancouver and Buffalo right near each other, both struggling to get over the hump in the playoffs. The difference being Buffalo was pretty good during the regular season. Vancouver had some 59-point seasons, and they're 59 points on the season. Number 10, a team with some pretty good overall numbers, especially early in the decade, the New York Rangers. A team that made, I believe, was there 2 conference finals in there or 1? I think it's 2. But they did have some good results, especially, again, early in the decade. And later on in the decade, of course, you get into Trader Phil territory. And as I've said, Phil Esposito, never a boring day with Phil Esposito at the helm. And so, yeah, the New York Rangers end up finishing 10th. And 1940 isn't a chant yet in the 80s. It's on the way, though. At least I think that started in the early 90s was when the 1940 chant really got going. Might have been around the 80s. It's possible Islander fans were taunting him in the 80s. It's possible our Philly fans, because Philly, right? Number 9. A team that was very good in the regular season and almost moved to Saskatoon. Yeah, St. Louis. And yes, they almost moved to Saskatoon in 1983. And Saskatoon was very receptive to the idea of having a hockey team. And yeah, it didn't end up happening. They didn't get Pittsburgh either. They were definitely a city that would have enjoyed having the Pittsburgh Penguins there. And it would have been interesting if St. Louis had moved to Saskatoon, because odds are, when we went through all of those problems in the mid-90s with Canadian teams and finances and moving to the States, the Saskatoon Blues probably would have ended up moving too. They probably would have moved to an American location. But the NHL stepped in and went, wait, what? And maintained the St. Louis Blues in St. Louis. And so we end up with a much better scenario for St. Louis. And outside of that disastrous year, and they don't end up having a draft pick that year either. They stayed out of the draft. You have that 1 year Mike Liut was fantastic, and you have some decent little runs along the way. They win their division a few times. Yeah, it's the Norris division, so the Norris division has its issues during the 80s, but St. Louis was pretty good. Speaking of Norris division, Chicago. Chicago was pretty consistent throughout the 80s. Some bad seasons here and there, but once they reached the postseason, they were dangerous. That came through in 1982 as an example, when Vancouver was knocking out Calgary and LA. Chicago took out some better teams too, and then of course they lose in the conference final to the Canucks. But when you look at the overall decade, Chicago did pretty well. It was a pretty good, although they did have some down seasons as well. Remember that one 66-point season that they got in the playoffs? I remember there was the battle between they and Toronto at the very end there. And yeah, they had some good battles with Toronto in the playoffs. Hey, Toronto wasn't a slouch in the playoffs either. They just needed to get there more often. But yeah, Chicago, Mike Keenan, all that other stuff, is going to happen in the 90s. Don't tell the 80s. They want it to be a surprise. Number 7, teams that have moved. The Minnesota North Stars, a team that never should have moved. Minnesota is the state of hockey, and the North Stars never should have moved. And my first year watching hockey, 81 playoffs, and Minnesota North Stars go all the way to the finals before the Islanders go, that's cute, you think you have a chance, and down you go. But the North Stars ended up having a pretty decent decade. The problem was they never quite got back to that. They never realized that potential that finalist appearance showed. So there was an expectation this team would win a championship that didn't happen. Not with that roster and not in this city. But the North Stars still to this day, obviously I cheer for Dallas because I cheered for the North Stars. And it was sad when Minnesota moved to Dallas. I mean, we all saw it coming. And it was bad ownership. And then bad attendance happens when there's bad ownership. Ask fans in Ottawa right now. And it was the death knell for the Minnesota North Stars in Minnesota. Number 6, good regular season team, able to make the Stanley Cup Finals. Not able to go further than that. Boston. Didn't win a Stanley Cup in the 80s. They managed to reach the Stanley Cup Finals in 88. They had a conference final or two in there as well, I do believe. And I say do believe because I just go through all the numbers. I just add it all up and I start up the video. But Boston had some really good regular seasons and were tantalizingly close to being champions with Ray Bourque, Andy Moog, Cam Neely, and others. And it just didn't quite happen for them. So they end up being 6th on the overall countdown because, again, great regular season success. They were good in the playoffs. They couldn't beat Montreal with regularity, but occasionally they would knock off the Montreal Canadiens. And they played Montreal a lot. So they and the Montreal Canadiens hurt each other on this chart quite a bit. Number 5, our first Stanley Cup champion from the 80s comes up in number 5. And that's Calgary. Now, the Flames had a good run their first year in Calgary as well. They went all the way to the conference finals where they lost against the Minnesota North Stars. And, again, that's a pretty good run from a team in its first year in a city. And so the Flames started out pretty good. They had some iffy years in the mid-'80s, but by the late 80s, they were one of the best teams in the league. Now, what hurts Calgary when I'm, with this, is they would lose to Edmonton, who were just Edmonton, in the second round. So if they were in the Norris, they probably would have reached conference finals a little bit more, probably would have got more points in this. But again, I can't be subjective. It has to be an objective. Okay, these are the points I'm awarding, and just go with that. Because if I overly complicate it, I'm looking at a board right now where I've overly complicated trying to figure out all these rankings from 1981 through now. And it gets daunting. I end up with a headache, and it's too much. So, Calgary ends up 5th. You might be able to argue them for 4th. I would say that the team that's in 4th place did pretty well in the decade. Didn't win a Stanley Cup. Reached the finals in 1980. 1985 and 1987, right? So that's 3 Stanley Cup finals to the 1 Stanley Cup championship for Calgary. So I can understand the idea that Calgary might deserve it a little bit more. But this is where I point out, over the decade, the power rankings over the decade, Philadelphia had a really good decade. So they had that full 10 years. The Flames, they won the Stanley Cup in 89. They went to the finals in 86. So again, really close. The points between these two was very, very close. But Philadelphia did come out ahead. And again, it was a good decade, just didn't quite reach that height of an actual win for the Stanley Cup. Even though Ron Hextall did everything he could to get there in 87, it just they didn't quite get over the hump. But they were very tough out. Very, very tough out. Philadelphia Flyers, always tough. Number 3, Stanley Cup championship for the Montreal Canadiens that decade, which was a decade that was sort of an up and down decade. That Stanley Cup win in 86 kind of felt like it was out of nowhere because this was a team that since 81 it looked like it was in decline. And 86 they proved, no, we can still win a Stanley Cup, and they did. And of course, they were Stanley Cup finalists in 89 as well, and their overall decade was a pretty darn solid one. So the Montreal Canadiens, number 3. And if I did do a 1970s, I guarantee they're number 1. I mean, who else would be number 1 but Montreal, right? So Montreal gets 3rd place. Again, you can argue between Philadelphia, Montreal, and Calgary. There's very little to choose in between the 3 when you look at the overall success on the decade. This is just how the points told me they went. Number 2, very proud decade for the New York Islanders. 4 straight Stanley Cup championships. Finalists the year after. Absolutely amazing decade for the New York Islanders. And that's probably the greatest dynasty ever. Or is it? So this is where you're going to have your discussion. So the New York Islanders win 4 straight Stanley Cups, go to the finals in 84. The Oilers, they win the Stanley Cup in 84. They win it in 85. They win it in 87. They win it in 88. They lost in 86 off the own goal. and then they lost in 89 after Gretzky had left. But this was an Oilers team that won 4 Stanley Cups and lost a Stanley Cup Finals. And here's an Islanders team that won 4 Stanley Cups and lost a Stanley Cup Finals. The points difference between these two was very close. And so you can kind of call them both winners. Or you can say that that was a decade that 8 out of 10 Stanley Cup Final winners wore blue and orange jerseys. And the other 2 wore red. And it's one of those bizarre things. I remember a time when they were like, well, you got to wear blue to win a Stanley Cup. And then it changed. Up to the point where last spring I was talking about, hey, teams that wear blue don't win Stanley Cups. No idea why. And so, yeah, that was a very good decade for the Oilers all the way through, basically, where they started out as an underdog and then they would become the champions. The Islanders started out as the champions, stayed the champions for a long time, and then there was a decline towards the end of the decade. So overall, yeah, I think the Oilers are full value for first place on the power rankings from the 80s, and I'd be interested to know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. So again, I'll figure out some other way of doing a power rankings. I don't think I'll do the 70s, because again, the further back you go in history, the fewer views you're going to get on videos. And so for me, it has to come down to, okay, the amount of work I'm putting in, and then the view counts, and it all has to be, it all has to make sense for me, or else, I'm basically losing on the whole video making thing. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video, and hey, it's kind of fun with the big magnets, isn't it? I love doing the videos with the big magnets, so this is kind of fun. But there you go. Thanks again for all your support. Remember, stay home when you can. Stay safe as much as you can as well. And we will get through everything that's going on in the outside world right now. I look forward to the day where we can look back on me finishing videos this way and go, hey, Shannon, remember when you used to have to tell us to stay home and stay safe and wash our hands? Oh, good times. I'm so glad we're not going through that anymore. I look forward to that day every day. And between now and then, I'll be here making videos for you fine people. Thanks again for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.